Welcome to the NCDWI Guide podcast, where defenders of the Constitution assemble to prepare for courtroom battle and firm owners gather to develop marketing strategies that will revolutionize the practice of criminal defense. Here's your host, the NCDWI guy, Jake Minnick.
Hello, fellow freedom fighters, and welcome to episode 121 of the NCDWI Guy podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by Dr. Korin Leffler. She is an assistant professor of pharmacology and toxicology at the Brody School of Medicine at East Carolina University. She received her PhD in pharmacology and toxicology from the Brody School of Medicine, and that kind of dual discipline, I think, really allows her to have a very wide perspective on the impairing effects and beneficial effects of substances when it comes to DWI cases. She's acted as an expert witness and somebody to bounce cases off of when it comes to DWI cases. Great personality, and I think would be somebody that would communicate very well to a jury in terms of both being somebody that they could connect to, but also somebody that can explain science in down-to-earth terms, which is helpful for a jury, but also helpful for us lawyers. So hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did, and look forward to sharing Dr. Leffler's insights with you. Dr. Leffler, it's really exciting to have you on talking to the audience. Very, very excited about kind of this intersection between law and science that we get to talk about. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with the audience.
No, I'm really glad to be here today. I obviously have a passion for science since that's what my doctorate's in, but applying it to the legal system is one of these new passions of mine. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I think there's a real disconnect in the kind of district and superior courts, the trial courts of North Carolina, when it comes to how to interpret scientific evidence on DWI cases. And so whether it's educating ourselves primarily first or educating the judges, this is like a real point of emphasis, I think, for the bar moving forward, because it really can make a difference in terms of how a case is presented to the court and what's important, what's relevant. So if you don't mind to just kind of talk to us a little bit about your background and kind of what got you interested in this kind of intersection between pharmacology, toxicology, and the courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career more in the toxicology realm. I did a bachelor's degree at North Carolina State University, and I didn't really know what to do out of that, but I wound up at the EPA in a reproductive toxicology, and we were looking at pesticides and what they did to unborn children and some of the pesticide regulations. And so the toxicology was really interesting, and I ended up working in Bethesda, Maryland at the National Institutes of Health in neurology and neuroscience research. And then from there, I went back and did a master's in environmental tox. And so when I looked at doing my doctorate, I thought, well, I really like toxicology, but drugs and medical is really interesting. I ended up going into a program that was a PhD in pharmacology and toxicology. And then I focused my PhD more on the pharmacology side. So what I wound up being was a very well-rounded pharmacologist and toxicologist, which has really benefited me well. You know, when I work with attorneys and I look at cases, I can see it from both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a huge advantage. I think having, the understanding of how these drugs that are found in the system are actually impacting somebody's mental and physical faculties is obviously, at the end of the day, what we're trying to get to. So just being able to show that something is in a person's system, kind of outside of per se alcohol limits isn't all that important when it comes to kind of whether or not somebody is guilty of driving while impaired. So if you don't mind to just kind of, I think, I think one of the first places where we kind of get maybe off track or have a lack of understanding as defense attorneys is what is toxicology, what is pharmacology, what's the difference between the two? So if you don't mind to just kind of explain kind of what those different disciplines look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually get that question a lot when I work with attorneys. It's sort of the lead in, and it's actually caused legal problems because sometimes they'll get an expert who's a pharmacologist and they'll say, oh, he's not a toxicologist, throw it out. So the easiest way to explain that is that it's sort of two sides of a coin. Both of them are looking at how a substance enters the body, how it's metabolized, how it's absorbed, how it's distributed throughout the body, and then eventually eliminated or excreted. But pharmacology focuses on the positive things that we want to get out of the drug, what clinical thing that we want to achieve that's positive. And toxicology focuses on the negative side of it. So what are we getting that we don't want? How is it negatively impacting the body? And there's some subtleties and differences. A pharmacologist, when we look at something, we're like, oh, it worked in half the patient population. That's great. When a toxicologist looks at it, they're like, oh, it made 1% of everyone sick. That's not okay. So there are different limits depending on which you're looking at, because if toxicologists were okay with half of people getting very ill, that would not be acceptable. So one of the things that gets hung up with in the legal system is obviously, with DWIs or when you're looking at substances, the court is always looking at it as it's a bad thing. It's a negative thing. The person is impaired. But oftentimes, there's other explanations of what's going on in the body or how it's working in that individual. And so someone who has both backgrounds can look at more complex situations and be like, oh, wait, you know what? That positive on that urine screening test for cannabinoids, that's actually an antiviral medication that their doctor gave them. And if you didn't know that that antiviral medication can cause a positive on that urine screen, then we have a problem. And so that's where the two sides get confused, and it's beneficial to be able to know which one you're looking at.
Yeah, that's really helpful. In terms of that distinction between kind of pharmacology and toxicology, what would be kind of the places or cases that you kind of have tended to be able to offer more expert testimony on the toxicology end of things versus the pharmacology end of things?
Right. So basically, if you're dealing with a case that is straight sort of street drugs, you're going to be looking at toxicology more likely. If you're dealing with something more simple, straightforward, alcohol is the intoxicant, you're probably fine with toxicologist. If it starts getting into prescription medication, more complicated medication, then you probably need to start looking at it also from the pharmacology side. And if you can get someone who knows both, that obviously is really ideal, because these substances don't do the same thing in every person. And, we set these standards and we set these limits, but oftentimes when I get into a case, there are reasons why things are not according to the limits that were given. And someone, who has extensive training in what substances do in the body or drugs do in the body can look and know a little bit more about the science. And there's plenty of times I've been sent lots of evidence, and after about 15 minutes, I'm like, oh, wait, you know what? This thing in their medical record, it's making this test, look much differently than it actually is. So usually if it's straightforward, if it's a simple substance, toxicology is fine. If it starts getting more complicated, I do a lot of THC. That's one that's actually very complicated, and it's been a big issue with North Carolina and driving under the influence. We can maybe get into that a little later. But you really need to get a toxicologist or someone who understands it to explain how THC is not as simple as, or I should say, marijuana, cannabinoids, weed. It's very different from alcohol, and it has to be treated differently with tests and being evaluated whether it's actually impairing or not.
Yeah, I think, one of the things that I've seen several times with cases that I've been involved in is a client that is on a medication, has been on that medication for some period of time, but is actually taking less of that medication or forgot their dosage for the day. And so that kind of causes a imbalance in their system. And so from the officer's perspective, it's like, well, they told me they're on a prescription medication. I'm getting a blood draw. In the blood, this particular drug shows up. And so it's kind of this sense that then, well, that must be causing these impairing effects that I'm seeing, when really it's kind of the lack of the medication being taken that is kind of this withdrawal almost from not having taken the appropriate dosage or the dose at all, that is causing some of those effects. And again, I think explaining that to the court is often difficult because so many of these drugs are seen as only having negative impact and not as having that kind of positive impact that you were talking about. Is that something that in either clinical practice or otherwise that you've kind of seen as well?
Yes, absolutely. And that's somewhere I think a drug expert can sort of explain in language that is understandable and hopefully be trusted with the fact that they are. I teach medical students, I teach dental students, I teach, them how to prescribe these drugs, and the physicians come to me when they need drug expertise because they're dealing with lots of things and I just deal with drugs. But that's something that is super helpful in just educating the courts and judges and attorneys in that, if you can explain from a point of view that someone can understand how the lack of the drug can cause differences,
yes,
or how in this person the drug is acting differently. Or I've even seen, sometimes tolerance develops to drugs. So after someone has been on a drug for a very long period of time, they're not going to have the impairment that someone who just started taking it has. And then that's when you can bring in a drug expert to explain that, look, the body has compensated and functions normally at this level. And you're looking at it as an impairment. And in reality, it's actually where they normally function because they've been on the drug for so long. And those are prescription drugs. And a lot of prescription drugs will make you positive on some of these illicit substances.
right.
And it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I think THC is definitely kind of the big ticket item of our time with that. So many different medicinal purposes now coming out and research. It seems like every month there's some new use that is being developed. So yeah, if you just kind of referenced that, talk about some of the issues that you see on that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in THC, so I guess that's the one that everybody doesn't. So what I find is that attorneys and judges and people who aren't, in-depth scientists, they want it to act like alcohol. And
right.
Alcohol is something that is actually very unusual when it comes to drugs. So if you think of a graph, alcohol has what's called zero order kinetics, and it's a straight line. So it's eliminated from the body in basically a straight line. And you can take the slope and you can calculate how impaired the person was and how many drinks they maybe had a few hours ago. But that straight line that the body actually eliminates alcohol is very, very unusual. Most drugs, and THC included, is actually an S-shaped curve. And so you can't calculate it. It's much more complicated. THC actually really likes fat. And so it likes to live in fat cells. So something as simple as, not eating for 10 hours, the body starts breaking down fat, and levels of THC can go up in the blood and cause positives on a blood test. And maybe the person didn't actually have any marijuana ingested, but it was 3 weeks ago. So
right.
What gets confusing is that everybody, especially the legal system, they want a simple answer to these drugs. And alcohol is actually one of the very few that has a more straightforward answer than the drugs do. And so a lot of times with THC cases, it's much more complex. If you can get a drug expert in and sort of look at what's going on, it helps.
Yeah, and I guess when it comes to THC in particular, or kind of any drug really that doesn't have that kind of predictable elimination rate in terms of how the body is processing that, what does that do in terms of a positive or confirmatory test that shows that is in the system, even if it's in like a specific amount? What does that do in terms of interpreting those results?
So that's actually a great question. And it sort of leads to two thoughts that I have. The first is that it's really important that in order to prove impairment, you have two tests. And so the first is often called a presumptive test, and I like to call it a color changing test. It's technically called an immunoassay. And what they do is they detect to see a screening test, usually in the urine or blood, if these substances are there. But it's highly specific it's highly sensitive and not very specific. So what happens is you do get false positives, and you can get lots of false positives from lots of things. So a presumptive test or a color changing test that says, hey, detected, not detected, positive, negative, those are not concrete tests. Those are presuming that maybe something's there. If the answer is not quantitative, if the answer is detected or positive, those are just a presumptive test saying you need to look a little further.
Okay.
So there's no, determined without a doubt impairment if all they have is a positive or a detected, you really need a confirmatory test.
Okay.
So the way that they do it is you have the presumptive test first. And if that pops positive, then whatever they did the impaired substance on, be it blood or urine, it should be sent out for a confirmatory test for confirmation that there actually is an illicit substance there, because the false positive rate is so high. And so sometimes attorneys think, oh, well, here's this test. It says my patient's on amphetamines. And, they don't think, well, maybe he's not actually on it, or maybe it's a false positive. Maybe he took some cold medicine for his cold over the counter, totally fine, and popped positive. So make sure there's both of those tests. You need the color assay test is the easiest way to think of it, but it's basically an immunoassay. It says, it's a screening test. Right. And then the confirmation is the mass spectrometry. So that's where they extract out the sample and they put it through a mass spec, which basically breaks it down into ions and molecular structure, and they actually identify what's there. And that can be very different. So if you get approached with a case and all they have is that presumptive test, you have a lot of grounds to say, hey, you can't prove impairment with this. Like, you can't even prove what they were actually on. I usually just write up it's an easy, report for me. I'm like, you can't determine impairment off of a urine test. I mean,
yes.
Not only are you screening for an inactive metabolite that doesn't determine impairment at all, you don't even know if you actually have an impairing substance.
I had a couple of labs that came back in the last year, one about a year ago, where they had, I think, detected a positive screening wise for cannabinoids, but then when they tested, they didn't find any substances. I think this kind of confused the state, and they called the analyst in, and the analyst was pretty helpful in terms of explaining to the court, look, we did a screening test, we didn't confirm any impairing substances. I think she kind of was like, well, I don't really even know what I'm doing here. And she had mentioned during her testimony that the SBI was going to stop reporting the screening results to basically eliminate some of this confusion, for both the defense and the state, the court, like just to eliminate this as a point of confusion. And so the most recent lab that I got, that was a drug result lab, only had the confirmatory results in it. I'm sure that we could still get access to the screening tests that were done. But the screening, this was the first lab I've ever gotten where there was no screening results on that kind of summary report, the 2-page summary report that they do. So I thought that was kind of a good step in the right direction to just kind of be able to very clearly say what is actually present. Now, obviously, you still want that screening test so that, as you just mentioned, you can have that kind of 2-step process. But I think that some of the results from the screening were just causing too much confusion in terms of what are we seeing here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I think that is a step in the right direction if you're only getting the confirmatory test results. But the important thing to remember there also, after you've made sure that, you have the confirmatory results, that is not the end all be all. That does not mean that there is impairment. I've seen some who, when they quantify THC, for example, they're putting it at 1 nanogram. And, I know that Sarah, when I was listening to your podcast, was talking about North Carolina doesn't have a set amount for what they say is okay. A lot of states have 5 nanograms. And so, I looked at confirmatory results that was reporting 1 nanogram, which is so below the 5 nanogram cutoff. And it was a very heavyweight individual. And so I, explained that in heavier people, because THC can live in the body for months afterwards, there's no level of impairment that can be judged off of a 1 nanogram confirmatory result. When a lot of states have a cutoff of 5 nanograms, I mean, this could have been, he didn't eat breakfast and, his body had more THC, plus that's an inactive metabolite. So it gets much more complicated. And if you can really get either an analyst or a drug expert to look at the confirmatory results, sometimes even the confirmatory results don't say there's absolutely an impairment here, because the substance being confirmed doesn't equal they were impaired. So you really have to, look into the nuances of it in some cases.
And so in terms of the difference between that kind of presumptive or screening test and the confirmatory test, what is, kind of the way of thinking about those two tests from kind of like a legal perspective, if there is kind of some sort of evidence? And I would assume that most courts would keep out evidence of the presumptive or screening results if those were, kind of tried to be introduced through either oral testimony or through some sort of lab report at this point. But what is the kind of way of kind of speaking about that in terms of what the value of those two tests are?
Well, I definitely think, like I said, we need the confirmatory test for sure. And then what the value would be of an attorney and looking at those tests, it really depends on how you want to, I don't want to say attack it, but how you want to sort of analyze what you're looking at. So if you're looking at a confirmatory test and your client is saying that they were taking something else and they weren't taking what it's on, but it's showing up on the test, that's when you talk to a drug expert, or, hey, are there prescription medications that could be showing up here? Or are there metabolic differences in this person that could be making these levels higher, where they're saying it was 5 days ago and, the test is showing it's more recently? The other way you can look at it is organic chemists and analysts and drug analysts can look and make sure that the testing was done accurately. And so that's something that's outside my actual expertise, because I'm an expert in what drugs do in the body. But the organic chemists, and you can look those experts up on the Forensic Resources website, they can actually look at the mass spec parameters. They can make sure that they were normalized. They can make sure they were properly run. They can make sure that they were quality assurance managed. And a lot of times some of that slips through the cracks. And so it hasn't been, properly, weighted out, or the quality assurance isn't there. And so some of these analysts can look at the tests and be like, this is an error. This shouldn't have been done like this. And so it depends on which way you want to look at those confirmatory tests, whether you want to say what's going on with the body and the drug, or is this test actually accurate? And then you can choose which kind of expert you'd like to take a look or write a report that you could present either at district court or state superior court.
So in terms of once the result has come back, I think, where in the past, and this, again, this is not true for everybody, but I think many attorneys, including myself in the past, have kind of looked at a lab report and thought, well, if there is an impairing substance in the lab report that is confirmed, then we're kind of dead meat. And that's kind of true if you've got a Schedule 1 impaired substance to some extent. If they can show that really was there, it doesn't matter whether it was actually causing any mental or physical issues with the person, it's present. Kind of that's the end of the game. But with regards to all of these other substances, what is kind of the value, so to speak, of just knowing that this substance was present in somebody's system in terms of proving that they are actually impaired? Can you talk a little bit about just the science of what that actually means?
Actually, so that's also an excellent way of looking at it. And it's very complicated is the answer. There's a big push right now with THC and marijuana and a lot of the legal Delta 8 that's going around that will test positive and be confirmed. And they're actually trying to come up with some way to judge levels of impairment based off of what the actual blood results are of the cannabinoids or THC. And essentially what's been figured out is it's very difficult. And there are some levels that clearly, if it's off the charts really high, there's probably not much you can do. But there's a lot more in a gray area where, depending upon, the different person and the substance, there is not an exact formula. And so then that's where if you have a drug expert who can look at it and say, hey, there's a reason why this could not be impairing. And I think that's why it has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And to some level, the attorney has to evaluate, if it's worth bringing in that drug expert. Do I believe my client that's swearing that they didn't actually have these substances, and maybe there's another explanation, and maybe there is. And sometimes I have found other explanations when I looked at drug reports, or, sometimes it is what it is. I've looked at others and been like, nope, I can't help you. I was called in to look at a case where she had tested positive, but all they had was a urine screen. And they were trying to say, I mean, and her urine screen was positive for several different illicit substances. And they wanted me to make a statement that I could judge her level of impairment. And I just said, you know what? I cannot judge how impaired she was in her brain at that moment off of a metabolite screening in the urine, because that doesn't extrapolate. And I just said, no, I can't do that. But at the same time, there's been other cases that I've been called in and I've looked at and I'm like, oh, hey, look, he has renal failure. So his kidneys aren't working right. And so then that could explain why a drug that he took 5 days ago is still in his urine. He wasn't actually impaired. It's just that, his kidneys aren't clearing the drug like he should have been. And so it's really a case by case basis, which I guess isn't that helpful, but some of it is the attorney judgment of, is this worth looking into deeper and really bringing in an expert? Or is this sort of one that, an expert's not really going to tell me much because it's pretty clear cut what's going on?
Yeah, I think, even at the arrest and investigation stage, there are times when a drug recognition expert gets involved on the state senate. I've seen some DREs that really know what they're doing when it comes to investigating and doing all of the psychophysical testing and kind of doing a very detailed analysis of what substances the person is reported to be using and those type of things. And then some where there's some really sloppy DRE investigations. But a lot of times when there's these prescription medications or illicit substances that are being used, the investigating officer has very limited experience when it comes to drug recognition or impairing effects of drugs. It's really, they've been trained on how alcohol causes impairment, and that's, for the most part, it maybe some basic coursework in terms of other impairing substances. But that, I think, is, again, when that lab report comes back in, I think both the officer and the prosecutor sometimes get, it's kind of like, well, clearly the person was impaired based on what the officer saw. And, we found impairing substances in the system. And I think where an expert can be really helpful, not only in kind of bettering our own understanding of kind of the specifics of this particular case, but explaining it to the judge, is connecting what you're seeing from the person with the specific drug category and type of drug that was found in the person's system in the confirmatory test. The huge disconnect sometimes between what you should be seeing from the impairing substance that's in the system and the signs and indicators that they're actually kind of being reported in the officer's report.
Right. And it's really important to remember that everybody is different and everybody reacts to drugs differently. And a lot of times the way I like to explain it is a lot of not to downplay analysts or some of the drug recognition experts, but they basically get trained in what a drug does in 80% of people, because those are the fact sheets. Those are the quick sheets you can look up. It tells you, this drug does X, Y, and Z in people. The people who take the deeper dive and really the drug experts, we learn that there's the other 20% of people where it acts completely differently, or it acts, within different parameters. And so then those are the cases where I look at them and I'm like, oh, okay, look, yes, he was on Xanax. And yes, that usually makes you very sleepy. And, it's a benzodiazepine, which is why he screened positive for benzos. But you're saying he was, behaving completely different. Maybe he's enraged, maybe he's violent, but his drugs are saying he should be sleepy. And so then that's where someone who's a true drug expert could come in and say, look, actually, Xanax in particular can cause mood swings and rage and violent outbursts, even though in most people it makes them sedated and sleepy, and that's what we use it for. We also know there are people where it's different. And so that's something where I think sometimes people forget that science is not, every human is not exactly the same. And
Right.
so, when we put out these lists on what these drugs are doing, we're kind of normalizing it and generalizing it to what they do in most people. And so, you do come across the cases where you are seeing something different than what the actual, little fact sheet that fits on one page is. And you need to bring in someone who's got more depth of experience in these substances because they've been widely studied. It's just a matter of, what didn't make the quick list and fact sheet that, was learned quickly, and what's beyond the scope of what, whoever you're dealing with is even familiar with. And sometimes it's just a matter of education.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that so often those generalizations are what are used again by officers that are making the arrest, and then certainly by the court in terms of what they're expecting to see, and then also certainly by analysts in the courtroom that haven't had so many particular labs involving this particular drug, or haven't been called to testify on this particular type of drug, and so really hasn't been an issue until you're kind of called into the courtroom. That refresher of what is this specific substance actually going to look like in terms of impairing effects or anticipated effects doesn't become front and center until you're kind of called into that situation. So in terms of analyst testimony, is there anything that would generally be kind of outside of the kind of scope of knowledge for somebody that really hasn't had any interaction with that individual, medically or otherwise, except for just testing the blood? What things do you think would be well served to be kind of aware of on that front?
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize that most of the lab analysts, now not all of them, some have more extensive training, but most of them are really trained in how to run the tests, how to get the results, whether it's a presumptive test or a confirmatory test. They're really trained on how in the lab to do the bench work and do the test. As far as their knowledge on what these drugs are doing within the body or how those are functioning, that's really outside the scope of their training. They may have taken a quick course in it, but really their training is how to run these tests within the lab, how to look at them, how to come up with accurate results. So sometimes when analysts are actually testifying to, actions that the drug would have within the body, it could be argued that's outside the scope of their training, because most of them have not had training in, human pharmacology or human toxicology or how these are working. So in my view, and of course, I have a doctorate in this stuff, so I might be a touch biased. I am. But really they're trained to be analysts in that they can run the labs, and they run them very well. And the test results are usually very accurate. But when they're being asked to testify, behaviors that would be seen, that's really outside the scope of what they are experts in, because what they are trained to do is, be the analyst who runs the test, not look at the patient. They're certainly not, physicians who are looking at patients. They don't see clinical exposures. And most of their training with what the body is doing or what the drug is doing to the body, what the body's doing to the drug, that's outside the scope of their training. It's not really something you get into below a graduate level of education in this stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a real missed point of opportunity for us as a defense bar. I know I've kind of really overlooked this on many cases when voir diring a expert witness that is being presented by the state. It's kind of like, well, this person is from the lab. This is their job. They are doing these criminal labs or these blood draw analyses for criminal cases specifically all over the state. They must be qualified basically as an expert. And again, while they can kind of talk about what their findings are in terms of the results of the confirmatory tests that they're doing, again, if somebody has a bachelor's degree and then, has really had no further education in toxicology or this specific type of impairing substance, or like you said, how these substances impact the human biology. Again, these fact sheets, if they're just kind of parroting the information that are in these fact sheets, that's really, again, that's not good expert testimony. That's just being kind of, reading from some sort of treatise or whatever, kind of medical reference point that they're pulling that from. So that what that made me think of, there was a attorney, and I can't remember who had kind of come up with this, but when it came to breath testing, whoever kind of either is reading the rights on blood testing or on breath testing is referred to as the chemical analyst. Many times it's just the arresting officer. Sometimes it's a second officer, but they, state would introduce them. You're the chemical analyst in this case, and you did the chemical analysis. And so this attorney's first question would always be, so you were the chemical analyst? Yes, I was. And how many hours of chemistry was required in order to become a chemical analyst? And the answer is 0, right? Like, you're basically trained to push buttons or read a form. And so, that there's a lot of times I think just too much scientific weight given to somebody because of the fact that they're controlling the buttons or whatnot of the scientific test. And I don't want to make it sound overly simplistic, but at the same
No, I
time, you
agree
really need
completely.
that understanding.
I did a bachelor's in biology, and then I went at a bench and ran a lot of tests on toxicology. And, it wasn't until I went on and did 7 more years of graduate work that I realized that, the bench work and the labs that I was running and analyzing with my bachelor's, I really was, really only understanding the tests that I was running and the tests that I was analyzing. Extrapolating it beyond that, I think, is an overstatement of their expertise, because they haven't really studied the human body and drugs and toxicology. They really are experts in running the tests. And so that's something I think attorneys miss because they're not scientists. I mean, we look in the science community, we'd look at them and be like, oh, it's a research tech who's like running the tests.
Right.
But when it comes to the thinking and the writing of the papers or writing reports, it goes to the scientists who have had deeper, more extensive training.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to just kind of understand that distinction. And again, what are you allowed to talk about? Yes, should you be allowed to report what the findings were in terms of what you found in the blood? Yes, but without further training or information education, the impairing effects of those, I think there is a real kind of point of challenge that we often miss. And again, I know particularly I have missed many times in the past of just kind of saying, well, this person is a lab technician.
Right. They're
with
not
the
really
SBI.
qualified to say what the human body is doing under the influence of these drugs. I mean, I think if you put anyone else with a bachelor's degree up there and called them a toxicologist and had them start testifying about, what drugs do to the body, immediately everybody would be like, wait, they don't know. They can't testify. One of the things that likes to be thrown at me sometimes is, oh, well, you're not a clinician. And I say right up, I'm like, you're right. I am not a physician. I'm not a clinician. I am, however, an expert in drugs in the human body. And I'm the one the physicians come to and ask about drugs, because I don't diagnose. I'm not going to diagnose anyone. But when it comes to what drugs are doing in the body and how the human body is responding, that's where my training lies. So it's just important to remember that, there are some limitations when analysts are called to testify as to what drugs are doing within the body. It's really outside the scope of the tests that they're running.
Yeah, that's super, super helpful. In terms of the cases that you've been involved in, kind of as an expert, to look at the circumstances, what is kind of your general framework for when let's say attorney calls with a case? Can you take a look at this for me? What are some of the things that you're interested in knowing about the client that has been charged, or reports that have been done, labs, kind of what does that general framework look like on your end?
Sure. So that's actually that's a good question. So, and I've had attorneys concerned before because they're like, oh, well, there's the eyewitness reports of behavior and this and that. And what I always say is I am a scientist. I am just looking at the science. So the eyewitness reports are outside the scope of what I'm going to look at, because I am an expert in what drugs do within the body. And that is all I care about. So typically I will ask for, all police reports, because sometimes things come out that are interesting. If there's medical records, a lot of times it involves an accident. And so there's EMS records or accident records. Obviously, any toxicology tests, whether they're screening tests or confirmatory tests. And really that's sort of where I stop. And I'll ask to look at all of them, because it's important to have a full picture. But when I look at it as a scientist or a drug expert, toxicologist, I really try to focus on just the science. So my job is to look at the blood test results, the confirmatory results, the urine test results. And then if there's anything I can actually determine from a scientific standpoint on level of impairment. The way they acted, that's all what we call behavioral, and it's very subjective. It's very all over the place. And I consider that the attorney's problem.
I love it. So, that's great.
So I figure, whatever the behavior is, the subjective tests, that's all the attorney's problem. I simply look at the science. And so I look and see, looking at medical records or looking at what the tests are, whatever information I have, I look at just the science. And if from the science, I can say, hey, your client did appear to be impaired, I will just say that. A lot of times I'll just verbally say it on the phone. I never put anything in writing unless an attorney tells me to do so. I just say, hey, I really really can't help you out because it looks like this is an impairment to me. On the other hand, maybe I'm like, look, I'm looking at these and I can't judge impairment from this. I'm looking at all the tests. I can write that up in a report. I can say why. I can itemize it, make it sound, much more professional than I sound right now. Would you like me to write that report? And so then that's typically sort of the lens that I look at the incidences, because my personal opinion doesn't really matter. And what behavior goes on at the scene isn't my area of expertise. That's either a psychologist or an attorney or other people who are trained in those behaviors. And I try to keep myself strictly within the science lens of how can my drug expertise approach this case and what can I determine? And it's also the way that I ethically sleep well at night, because, if from the science, this is what I come up with, there's nothing to, emotionally get involved about. And if from the science, I can't determine anything, then I just say that. But a lot of times I think attorneys are concerned because they're like, oh, well, this and that. And I'm like, I really am just looking at the science, and I'm going to tell you, what I can determine from the tests that I'm looking at, if there's anything valuable, and then I communicate that to them and then ask if they'd like a report or not, depending on how they want to move forward with the case. And, sometimes I get brought in and don't even need to write a report. Sometimes they're just asking questions, is this my client saying this, is that possible? And I can just say, no, not really. Or yes, that is possible. I need to look at it further, or can I look into this in more detail? And so I try to keep myself very much within the lens of, and I think that's why I'm so sensitive about what people are experts in, is because you have to keep yourself completely within, your area of expertise. So yes. I teach medical school. I teach all sorts of cases. I probably could, do diagnosing, but I'm not a clinician. So I make sure to never diagnose anything, because that is not my area of expertise. I only look at the drugs. And I think that that's important when you look at experts. I also wouldn't say I'm not an organic chemist. I wouldn't look at these tests and start breaking down the mass spec itself. I'd say, hey, go talk to an organic chemist, because they are the ones who have doctorates in mass spectrometry and they can look at these tests. So I think sometimes
that's super awesome. I love that kind of, just focusing on what you can communicate about. And obviously that's what you want from an expert is somebody that's really, again, able to talk in great detail about what their specific discipline is. It's first, it's kind of like any evidence to me that I get on the case, whether it's body cam, dash cam, notes, anything, to me, the better, the more helpful, because if it's bad video, then I can show that bad video to my client. And it's like, we really don't have, much to go off of here. If it's, helpful video, then, the opposite is true. But the more that you have that information to go off of, and the more feedback that you're getting on your case, the better. So if you call Dr. Leffler and she says, hey, this is not a good case to take to trial, at least you've got that kind of answer back of, okay, at least now I know how to interpret this, report that I got from the SBI. And I think that's where, again, we're missing a real opportunity as a criminal defense bar is, for the most part. I mean, and again, there's probably a few attorneys across the state of North Carolina that are the narrow exception to this rule. I can think of a couple off the top of my head, but for the most part, we really don't have any business interpreting the results that are kind of found from the SBI report in terms of what does that mean? We know this substance is in the person's system. Now let's try to figure out what that means for this particular case. And instead of seeing that as, well, there is an impairing substance found, slam dunk for the state. Okay, well, now let's do some digging. Now that we know what is actually being has been analyzed and confirmed to be in my client's system, now let's figure out kind of what that means. And taking that to an expert witness is a place that I think is almost kind of a necessity when it comes to anything outside of alcohol. And I mean, certainly even in alcohol cases, there could be a great need to have somebody look at how the tests were performed and what the actual results are showing. But definitely on almost any other impairing substance, having somebody that really has a deep knowledge of the pharmacological or toxicological impact that's having is a huge benefit.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and even alcohol, again, people miss the whole metabolism thing. And the easiest way to explain it is, some people have 2 drinks and they're completely impaired, and then other people have 2 drinks and don't miss a step. And so, even with alcohol, having someone who looks at it and it says, where is impairment? Obviously, there's a legal limit set for alcohol. So that one's a little more straightforward. But if you start getting cases where they're retrograde analyzing formulas back, those formulas don't fit every single person, and people metabolize things differently.
Yes, for sure.
Enzymes are different. So again, that's another area where an expert would come in and say, all right, let's interpret this and let's see what these tests actually mean. But it's a good point when you're looking at these cases to realize that some of these experts can take a look and really do you justice and say, like you said, hey, you know what? And I actually had one attorney, I told him, I'm sorry, I can't make that statement because there's nothing I can get off that. And he said, well, that's what the last expert I called said too. I was like, well, at least I was consistent.
That's right. That's what you're hoping for.
Validated my opinion. But and I chuckled because I was like, apparently the other toxicologist he consulted also said they couldn't. I personally sort of laughed at that one, but
yeah, I love that.
But
well,
yeah,
I appreciate all the information, Dr. Leffler. Anything that you kind of think is important before we kind of end the conversation? Anything that you think is important for us to look at when we're getting a lab report or speaking to an expert? Relevant questions to ask somebody that we might be looking to get involved, or best way to determine what type of expert is appropriate? Anything that we're kind of leaving out at this point?
Yeah, I think we've actually covered most of it. I think the most important thing is to remember that getting those test results, like you said, isn't necessarily a slam dunk. If you have any inkling that it could be off or that there's grounds for your client not being impaired, it really might be worth consulting the right experts or looking a little deeper into the case, because, the confirmatory tests don't necessarily equal automatic impairment. And I think that's important. And a lot of times people miss that. They think, oh, here's the tests and, they're just impaired, end of story. So, just looking a little further sometimes really pays off.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I certainly appreciate all of the information and you sharing your wisdom and knowledge and experience with everybody in the criminal defense bar. Really appreciate the conversation.
No, I did too. I really enjoyed it. And, I enjoy listening to your podcast now that I know about it.
That's awesome. Love it. If you found the information in this podcast to be valuable, I simply ask that you pay it forward and share this podcast with another member of the legal community. Also, if you would leave us a rating or a review on whatever platform you are listening on, I would greatly appreciate it.